I very much appreciate this, and in fact, my journey toward a partnership ethic and the idea of partnership with nature comes in part because of my status as a woman in the environmental movement and in the academy, and trying to grapple with the questions of the relationship between women and nature. And so it comes out of a number of problems. One is the problem of women and nature in Western culture as being subordinate to men, of the answer to that came up through feminism and ecofeminism, of which I have been a part during most of my academic life. And the problem that raises in terms of metaphors, not just of Mother Nature and a living, nurturing earth that one has in the Renaissance, but the other side of that, the rape of virgin nature, the witch, the crone, the dark side of the relationship of women and nature. And so partly out of that problem, I have wanted to move away from metaphors of the feminine earth and toward the idea of partnership with the earth. And I'd like to try and propose an ethic that does bring women into the picture. I think in the ethic that Andrew Light put forward, I didn't see any women. I saw a picture of little girls, but I didn't see any women philosophers. And there have been numerous women philosophers and feminist, ecofeminist philosophers who have tried to deal with the question of environmental ethics. A second problem comes with respect to people of color and nature, minority peoples, third world peoples, peoples of diverse cultures, diverse experiences, and the relationships between people of culture. This conference is, for the most part, as far as I can tell, mainly white. And yet one of the most inspiring and dynamic movements in the environmental movement today is the environmental justice movement. And I'd like to give recognition to that movement and the need for it in this idea of a partnership ethic. Another problem is the problem of the apparent human separation from nature, that humans don't seem in much of the rhetoric to be part of nature, or nature in humans. So that connection, that relationship is something that I want to acknowledge in my partnership ethic. The idea of returning the pendulum to some kind of equal dynamic embedded in relationship. For most of human history, what we think of as non-human nature was superior to humans, and humans basically played the card that nature dealt. Since the 17th century, scientific revolution and mechanistic philosophy, that pendulum has flipped in the other direction, and humans, through science, technology, and capitalism, especially capitalist culture, have had the ability and the hubris to control and dominate the natural world. So partnership ethics, to me, helps to resolve these problems which have been paramount for me in my own intellectual development. So I want to talk about what a partnership ethic is, why I think we need it, where does it come from historically, and some examples of how it can help us to resolve environmental problems and move forward toward a new ethic for the 21st century. So first of all, I frame it in terms of the following idea. The greatest good for the human and non-human communities is in their mutual living interdependence. This is an ethic that's grounded in human communities in a particular place, relating to the ecological or non-human community that shares that place. So it's grounded in relation. not in the ego or the self, not in society as is the utilitarian ethic, not even in the land or the cosmos as the Leopold ethic, but in the idea of the relationship, which is a dynamic one of interchange and interdependence. So partnership ethics has for me these precepts, and these are all relational precepts. The idea of equity between the human and non-human communities. The idea of moral consideration for humans and other species, the intrinsic value, the intrinsic right of other species and non-human nature to be here because of the fact that it evolved as did we. Again, a relational idea of respect for the cultural diversity of peoples, indigenous peoples, third world peoples, peoples who have lived in a place for millennia, and the diversity of the biota in those particular places. So how do we respect both and move toward maintaining both through this idea of partnership ethic? The inclusion of groups of people who have been traditionally omitted from environmental ethics and from liberal democratic society in general, women, minorities, people of color, third world peoples, and nature. Nature is an actor in my environmental ethic. Nature is at the table. Nature is a subject, an equal subject with humans. So how do we include nature, who is mute in one way in terms of, say, the English language, but yet speaks to us in very different kinds of languages? How do we include nature at the decision-making table in the process? And then finally, an ecologically sound management that recognizes the health of both the human and the non-human communities. Basic needs for humans: food, clothing, shelter, and energy, security, and nature's needs to reproduce and maintain a vital existence. So why do we need it? We all know why we need it. The global ecological crisis and global change, which encompasses ozone depletion and endangered species, deforestation, loss of forests, soil erosion, and so on. This cartoon here says, "Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth." It's the earth covered with people, and some wise guy down here says, "Okay, now what?" So now what is what we're trying to answer here. Population is covering the earth, and the population issue, not population control, but the problem of population pressure on the land is one of the major issues. So where did we get to this? The problem of human domination over nature is part of our Western cultural heritage since the 17th century. And here we have Lucas Cranach's painting of Adam and Eve, the fall from Eden. And what's interesting to me about this image is Eve is the more assertive of the two people. Eve is the first scientist. Eve is the one that takes the apple, the gift of the snake, and she is really at the root of human curiosity and understanding about the earth itself. Adam is looking very quizzical, very uncertain as to whether he wants to participate in the experiment. And this is an interesting picture because Mark Twain wrote a little spoof on all of this back in the end of the last century, and he said, "She's taken up with a snake now, will emigrate." I spell trouble ahead. So here is the idea that we can recover from the fall from Eden. And again, this is the fall of the apple, the fall toward the earth, the recovery from the fall through the recreation of Eden on earth. And this is the major narrative of Western culture since the 17th century. Francis Bacon, in the Novum Organum of 1620, says that man can recover that right over nature, which was lost in the fall, because nature belongs to humanity by divine bequest. Man should endeavor to establish and extend the power and dominion of the human species, the human race, over the entire universe. So by the end of the 17th century, through the work of many of the major fathers of modern science, we have emerging the model of the universe as a clock. God is a clockmaker, becomes an engineer, a mathematician, and the human body becomes a machine. Mathematical equations are what allow us to predict and therefore control nature. That's that equal sign between the two parts of the equation. You do the same thing to each side of the equation, and if you can solve the equation, you can therefore predict, and if you can predict, you can dominate nature. So by the end of the 17th century, we have the vision, the new vision of mechanistic science. And we have the idea that mechanistic science combined with technology and capitalism can help us to reinvent the lost Eden on Earth. So European conquest of the Americas, Australia, the rest of the temperate world is a narrative of transformation of wilderness to garden, and it becomes the story of Western culture through cutting down forests, irrigating deserts, making the desert blossom as the rose. This gets us then to today, reinventing Eden today. The reinvented Eden is the shopping mall on the one side, where we can spend the gold grown by the fruits of the market to our heart's content, surrounded in an enclosed space with trees and flowers, the desert of the parking lots outside. And we can control human and other animals' genomes through the new biotechnology, through cloning, genetic engineering. All of these things then lead us to the point of the new millennium, the new 21st century, why we need a new environmental ethic, and why I think that ethic should be called a partnership ethic. So where are the origins of the partnership ethic? For one thing, we begin to get a change in the dominant narrative of domination and control to another narrative, an idea of conservation and preservation and ultimately environmentalism, beginning in the late 19th century, where forest reserves are created, rangelands and soils, water, the beginning of the great projects of the damming up the rivers, especially in the West. 1864, we have the first idea expressed by George Perkins Marsh in his book Man and Nature, that humanity should work in partnership with the natural world. Man should become a co-worker with nature in the reconstruction of the damaged fabric. So not only the perception that things are going downhill with respect to the environment, so that we have need a new environmental ethic, but we need a new way of managing our relationship to nature, one of restoration. So the idea of restoration ecology emerges at this time. We can restore the waters, forests, and bogs, Marsh tells us, which have been laid waste by human improvidence or malice. Aldo Leopold contributes to this, and Leopold's essay, The Farmer is a Conservationist, written in 1939, is a partnership ethic. He says, when land does well for its owner and the owner does well by his land, when both end up better by reason of their partnership, then we have conservation. So Leopold contributes to this environmental ethic. The philosophers of the Frankfurt School also, who are making a very vitally important critique of domination, pose the alternative. Horkheimer says, once it was the endeavor of art, literature, and philosophy to express the meaning of things and of life, to be the voice of all that is dumb, to endow nature with an organ for making known her sufferings. We have lost that in the process of the domination and control of nature. He says today, nature's tongue is taken away. So how does nature speak to us in a different voice, in a different tongue, in a different language? Marcuse gives us also the second generation of Frankfurt School. The idea of nature, he says, as an opposing partner. Nature works with us in some instances and opposes us in other instances. Nature is an ally, a life force in its own right. Thinking about nature in a different way other than domination and control. The struggle with nature, he says, may subside and make room for peace, for a letting be, just letting nature alone, accepting nature as it is. Of the feminist philosophers, Riane Eisler speaks about the idea of a partnership society. Partnerships of the past. Most societies have been dominator societies. Matriarchies are the domination of one sex over the other. So are patriarchies, the blade. But the partnership society, she argues, that existed in the past and took a 5,000-year detour through history to potentially the present, link the sexes, bring women and men together, working together to solve problems. Women and women together, men and men together. So the idea of partnership and of men and women as partners comes out of our own particular milieu, our own particular culture in the late 20th century, in which we recognize the existence of gay and lesbian couples working together, living together as partners, and we make that partnership a partnership with nature as well. So she calls this idea of partnership a guylomy. David Abram helps us in the next step, the spell of the sensuous. I don't need to try to reproduce David's arguments here because you have heard him today and you will hear him again tonight. But the idea that something was lost with the alphabet and with written language, that the oral cultures help us most to understand and to communicate and to hear nature's voice. The rustling of leaves in an oak tree is a way of nature speaking to us. If we go outside, we hear the wind in the aspens here. The aspen grove itself is a kind of voice. And the soundscape around us, the rhythm and lilt of the local soundscape. So David Abram, Morris Berman, Owen Barfield, who've talked about participation and the use of all the senses in hearing nature as a partner at the table and as a way of hearing what nature is telling us. Chaos theory also challenges the domination of nature. It challenges mechanistic science. Edward Lorenz's butterfly effect, or the sensitive dependence on initial conditions, raises the question, could a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil result in a tornado in Texas? It might or it might not, but the equations to tell us cannot be solved by linear differential equations. These weather patterns are chaotic, unpredictable. So it's the unpredictability that challenges the hubris of mechanistic science. Irregularity is a fundamental property of nature, not the regularities that the mechanistic science describes so beautifully. The laws of thermodynamics, the laws of electricity and magnetism, Newton's laws of gravitation, and the laws of motion are beautiful. They're just fantastic. And yet they apply, according to the complexity theorists and the chaos theorists, to a very small domain. The usual is the realm of chaos and complexity. We live in a mechanistic world, and we wouldn't build bridges or go up ski lifts or whatever without believing in it. And yet it describes only the unusual rather than the usual. So all these approaches help us to move away from the idea of domination and control of nature and toward the need for a partnership with nature. So how can partnership ethics help us? Ian McHarg, in his work on design with nature, in which he designed numerous ecological communities, wrote about nature and humanity as co-tenants of the universe. Nature and humanity are partners in their mutual survival. If that doesn't happen, nature as we know it today will be changed irrevocably, and humans perhaps with it, and perhaps will not be survivors in that transformation. So what do we do to bring about this partnership ethic? How can we give some examples here? The Management Institute for Environment and Business gives whole booklets about examples of how partnerships with nature can work through voluntary collaborations in ecological citizenship, environmental citizenship that we heard from Andrew Light. Voluntary collaborations among organizations working toward a common objective. You set out the problem and you commit to a solution. You commit to reaching this. It might take 2 years of meetings every week, but this avoids litigation and helps us move toward cooperative agreements among the stakeholders. So the table includes not only people from the business community, planners, minorities, but also nature. And nature's voice is heard through people who speak to it or going into nature. The whole table might get up and leave the room and spend a day or 2 days in nature through using the Council of All Beings or various kinds of exercises that help us to hear nature. So I'm going to just give very briefly a few, how much time?
4 minutes. Is that all right?
Sure. I'll just give a few examples. So how can we work together to design with nature? Multicultural teams of people. One of the issues that minorities have raised is who speaks for me? Can a white woman speak for a black woman? Well, minorities are going to be at the table, and nature is going to be at the table. So here are just a few examples. The soil itself has a voice. We can listen to that voice. And to landscape architects, Anna Mathur and Dilip Dakuna, who was a graduate student at Berkeley, proposed a design for Governor's Island in New York Harbor, in which they looked at one end where the bedrock was solid and firm, and where they would put amphitheaters and permanent structures. The opposite end, the dialectic, the displaced soil that was taken out of the bowels of New York City in the building of the subway system and just dumped on the other end of it, creates a dialectic, a flux that can be used for harbors and walkways and restored nature. So this is one way to hear the voice of the soil and have a dialectical partnership. Another example of a community working together in Minnesota, Maplewood, Minnesota, Joan Nassauer, organized meetings with residents of a lower middle class community who didn't want anything done to their community, but where a need was apparent for redesigning runoff. So they reintroduced wetlands and native prairies, native communities, and brought wildness into a traditional neighborhood. So here, an example, the Anacostia River had been channelized, and you can see these stages. Up to 1965, it's almost straight, and the proposed reconstruction is the final one, where the channel is recreated and the ancient river, filled now with restored wetlands, helps to remove pollution and runoff. People working in partnership with nature and nature's processes. In Mississippi, a design for a convention center in which one moves from the convention center gradually outward into the marshes and the restored meadows and swamps that contain egrets and turtles and dragonflies. Yellowstone Park, how can we be partners with fire, with something so deadly and scary as fire? And yet we can see that fire is an important tool for humans to use that helps heal and replace nature if it's used carefully. An example from Oakland, California, an African-American, Latino, European, and Hispanic community of people living in the area, restored, working together, restored biodiversity to oak groves, and they used fire, but they also worked out a way in which the restoration project was participated in by everyone and approved by everyone. And example of chemical degradation of the landscape from exploited miners in southwestern Pennsylvania, restored through settling ponds that gradually change the pH of the chemicals that flow through it and produce clear water, and yet planted with vegetation that echo the orange and green and yellow-green pools that result. Los Angeles, California, under the freeway, which is abandoned land, community gardens by people in the diverse community, which allow crops to be grown through use of treated gray water, parking structures that have gardens on the roofs, and so on. So people, again, working with nature. So humanity can listen to and hear nature's voice. We can respond with care, with reverence. We can work in cooperation with nature as a non-human partner. It offers the possibility of a healthier, more aesthetically pleasing cultural and natural environment for our own and future generations. So that's it.
So should we take a few questions? Okay, comments, questions? Yeah, Jeff.
Hi, Carolyn. I was wondering if you'd given thought to how the examples that you've given are regional examples of that, like they really work well. Is there any way to scale that up to a problem like,
yes. Right. I think this idea works best in a local community and on a local scale. Because people are involved and excited and so on. However, every community is part of a much larger ecosystem, part of a watershed, part of air pollution. And if there's businesses involved, those businesses may have overseas branches. So you can do it locally and still have an effect globally. Nike, for example, wants to build a major high-rise headquarters. Okay, so if you're going to give them the permits to do it, then they have to do something about labor practices in Southeast Asia, for example. So I think it's all embedded in a much larger context, and it can be dealt with at the bargaining table so that it works from the inside out.
I was just wondering if the bargaining table gets bigger and bigger, it's harder to...
Kyoto, for example. Yeah, it does, absolutely. And the people who are at the table who are intractable are not going to contribute to some kind of a solution. And so many problems can't be dealt with this way. It has to go through litigation. But this is one way.
For your presentation, it was just like Andrew's spoken, you gave a very nice history of different things. But the one thing that I found missing in your history of conservation movement is also in the late 19th century, perhaps even earlier than conservation, came the preservation movement, and you didn't mention that. And I'm just wondering if I might hypothesize to sort of suggest where it might fit.
Yeah.
And that is that it was the antithesis of the mechanistic domination, so that the alternative was either we dominate or we build a fence around it and don't dominate it.
Yeah.
And you're offering a kind of Hegelian synthesis here between these two extremes. Is that an accurate?
It's absolutely part of it, and I left it out. But yes, I mean, you have, first of all, late 17th century, the appreciation of the beautiful and the sublime that becomes the reinforcement in Romanticism in the 18th century of the beauty of nature, the majesty of mountains. Mountains are no longer warts on the landscape, but something to be held in awe. So that's a beginning of aesthetic appreciation. And then, of course, in terms of the U.S., native peoples and colonists it wasn't a uniform transformation in terms of just slash and cut through, but subsistence farming and ways in which farmers worked with the land. It wasn't all just domination, but as capitalism becomes more and more prevalent, you get that dominant narrative, and it spawns right along with it as a dialectic, a counter narrative. And you're absolutely right, preservation. And Thoreau is a good example of an articulation of a preservationist narrative at Walden Pond. And he draws on people in the deep past that were residents and animals and nature at Walden. So you're absolutely right. And all through, you could say all through history there's a counter narrative.
The examples can be multiplied so many times as your examples gave rise to, but one that strikes me as could be interesting is the work by Frederick Margolin, Hoffman, and Eduardo Grillo, and I think Eduardo Aldo Leopold. They have a book called Regeneration, and it's on this organization of the Quiche and Aymara people. What's it called? It's not possible.
No.
Okay, there's an organization of indigenous peoples and altogether implemented by indigenous peoples in the Peru-Bolivian highlands, which is a very interesting example of partnership ethics, initiated by people who came out of the science community, native people, educated, and then returned because they felt the dissatisfaction of science.
Excellent. Examples like that really give me hope that there's a possibility in this. Even though it might not be called partnership ethics, I see it as partnership. Thanks for that. Okay. Probably time to take a break, huh?
Okay. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.